Uh, shall we begin? It is 6 o'clock.
Sure.
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you so much, everybody, for being with us today. I am Saranya, and under my venture, the Kolatkar Crawl, I try to take people on walkthroughs and readings of Arun Kolatkar's Kala Ghoda poems. This started off when I was researching for my thesis around 2 years ago, when I had to, I was spatially mapping the Kala Ghoda poems in Bombay. So, of course, I graduated a year ago, but I couldn't let go of the Kala Ghoda poems or Arun Kolatkar. So, I decided to start a venture of taking people on this journey with me. Of course, the day that I was supposed to start the walk, the lockdown began, and it really made me rethink how to experience poetry, how to experience Arun Kolatkar himself. So I thought, why not get with the times and do a Zoom reading? And so for the audience, I emailed Arundhathi and Laetitia, and the both of them were extremely pleasant and very kind and agreed to have this conversation with us today. So thank you, Arundhathi. Thank you, Laetitia, for being here. This conversation is called Reading Kolatkar Under Lockdown. And it is a strange time to be reading poetry, but I think it's also a poignant time to return to someone who is my favorite poet. And so I'm really grateful that both Arundhathi and Laetitia have agreed to have this conversation with me today. For those of you who don't know, and it's impossible to not know, Arundhathi is an author who has written 12 books. She has authored both prose and poetry. She's written a biography on Sadhguru. She's written a book on Buddha, Adi Yoga. She's also a Bhakti poet, and Jeet Thayil describes her poetry as a commute between home and the world, which I think is just lovely. Her most recent book of poetry is Love Without a Story. She's edited a collection of Bhakti poems called Eating God. Apart from having received numerous awards and fellowships, including the T.S. Eliot Prize and the inaugural Khushwant Singh Prize, the Charles Wallace Homi Bhabha Fellowships. She's also worked as the head of dance and Chauraha at the National Center of Performing Arts in Bombay, and is the editor of the India domain of Poetry International Web. So I really thank you so much, Arundhathi, for being with us today. I'm really very grateful. Laetitia is an academic, author, researcher, currently a research fellow at the CNRS in Paris. Her research interests include contemporary Indian poetry, modernism in India, and the poetics of literature. Her book, Arun Kolatkar and Literary Modernism in India, is just groundbreaking in the depth of its research on Arun Kolatkar and Bombay. And for those of you who know me well enough, know that I have cried to sleep with this book many a night while researching for my thesis, and it's been like a comforting pillow. So thank you, Laetitia, for that. She has also translated Kolatkar's Kala Ghoda poems to French, co-edited special issues called The Worlds of Bombay Poetry for the Journal of Post-Colonial Writing, The Locations of World Literature, Perspectives from Africa and South Asia, and is currently working on a book as well on the poetics of modernism, the cultural literary freedoms of during the Cold War in India. So it's just fantastic. I have a poet, I have an academic, both extremely esteemed in their fields. So really, thank you so much. So today we will be talking about our own entry points into Arun Kolatkar's work. So I was hoping that the two of you could begin by kind of just talking about how you read Kolatkar, your entry into his writing. So Arundhathi, would you like to begin?
Sure. Thank you, Saranya. First, let me say that I wasn't awarded the T.S. Eliot Prize. I was on the shortlist for it, but it's something I'm happy about, and thank you for mentioning it. But I also want to say how wonderful this is to think that one can just open a window like this one evening, talk about a poet whose work has mattered a great deal and in very different ways to many of us, judging by those who've logged in, and certainly for the three of us. And to think that this is work that cuts across culture and chronology and temperament, and that it endures, and that we still want to talk about our personal entry points into it. I think that is wonderful. I'm delighted to be here with Laetitia, whose book I finally dipped into yesterday, recommended, and with you, Saranya. Thank you for making this happen, really. What I'd like to actually share is, since you asked about personal entry points, I'd like to actually talk about the very first time I read Arun Kolatkar's work. I was in St. Xavier's. I happened to be sitting in the library. And I remember picking up this copy of Jejuri. And my first response was one of just being absolutely startled. And to think that 35 years later, I still have this dog-eared, battered copy of Jejuri, and that I open its pages as I did yesterday, and I'm still startled, I think is tribute to Kolatkar, really. Tribute enough from my end. But I want to say that there are really three reasons why I feel drawn to his work. And I mentioned these because I smuggle in a poem or his poems aloud, which is always a pleasure. I think the first reason I'm drawn to his work as a practitioner and as an omnivorous reader of poetry is just the use of image, the precision of image, the unsentimental, unflinching, relentless capacity for photographic observation. And the does this without sentimentalizing, without generalizing, just the ability to keep the faith that the image will do its work. That if you look at something long enough, hard enough, attentively enough, it will be transfigured, that the gaze is capable of doing that. So this comes home to me time and again in Jejuri, for instance. I remember the very first time I came across that image of the bus as this kind of feline and predatory presence. You know, the bus that furs softly, that has a that has a cat pilgrim before its teeth, between its teeth. That image has never gone away. Make a point without invoking abstract nouns, without talking about religious tourism and spiritual commercialization and mercantilism. None of that. There was no journalese. There was just the ability to use image that is in fact so much more enduring than any other statement. And that brings me to the poem that I've always loved in Jejuri, which is An Old Woman. And I'd love to read it, and I might just do that at this time, but I want to say very often people have mistaken Jejuri for just a scathing indictment of the notion of the conventional notion of the pilgrimage. And they see it often as a repudiation of religion and so on. What always excites me, though, when I go back to Jejuri is the fact that, like so many Bhakti poets, whom we'll go on to talk about, hopefully at some point, Arun Kolatkar reminds us that this journey is not without its surprises. And he, in fact, gives us even what I would consider to be a darshan poem. And that darshan happens not where we expect it, not in the temple, not in the sanctum. It happens when you see the pie dog in the station. It may happen when you see this dog with its litter of pups. It happens certainly in this vision of the old woman, this beggar woman, who's encountered by the speaker of the poems. And there is this extraordinary image which starts with her eyes and the wrinkles around her face, as deeply particular as that, and then moves from that deeply singular moment to the temples, to the sky. It's really what I would call a Vishwarupa Darshan. You know, but where you least that's where
I'm sorry, Arundhati, I think the connection is low because I think your voice hung.
would love to read that poem, and I will maybe later at this time, but I want to comment it upon, and which I think has to be written, and make it remarkable. To take the miraculous. Am I inaudible, Saranya?
Arundhati, now you are, but your screen is no, your screen is stuck.
Am I there now, Saranya, or not?
Yes, you're here now.
I'm sorry, I went away. Did I in between?
You did, but you're back.
Okay.
Yeah. We can hear you and we can see you.
Okay, so very quickly, I think my second point is really the fact that he reminds us again and again of the alchemical powers of poetry. The ability to take something absolutely commonplace and quotidian and transform it into the miraculous. I remember this Italian academic friend of mine who once told me, and this was in 2001, that when he was planning his trip to India, and he wanted help with his itinerary, and I thought, you know, I had to offer the usual Rajasthan, Agra, Kerala type of options to him. But I remember him telling me the one place he was absolutely sure he didn't want to miss was Jejuri. And that's when I realized, very determinedly dowdy, non-glamorous species, but that it is possible for a poet to take this dusty, nondescript temple town in Western Maharashtra and make it a place of literary pilgrimage. It's possible for that act of enchantment to be pulled off. In the quite same way in Kala Ghoda poems, there is a poet who is able to transform this underbelly of South Bombay, to transform this whole pageant of outcasts and turn them into the stuff of urban legend. You know, this requires a particular kind of magic. This is unstable again. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Saranya?
I can hear you, but your voice lags a bit, but now I can.
Okay. So all those marvelous poems in Kala Ghoda poems, you know, from, I'm going to read a little bit of one, but all those that are able to take, you know, whether it's that the woman delousing her lover, and he speaks of harmonics of knits, whether it's the Philharmonic Gulmohar, whether it's that famished, scrawny little kitten that has its mystical moment when kissing its first shrimp, you know, all these absolutely commonplace moments turned lyrical, you know, in the hands of poets like this. But that has to lead to my Idli section of the Kala Ghoda poems, because I remember when reading this, realizing that Idlis would never be the same for me again. And to think that it's an Idli, you know, for most of us, the dosa at least is a mild prospect, but this is an idli, which is as humdrum and everyday as you can get. And it is made magical, simply because of this banquet that it becomes for this impoverished bunch of people at Kala Ghoda. I'd like to read that section. Islands of idlis float belly up or splash about in seas of sambar among the wreckage of red chili peppers, submerged aubergines, torpedoed tomatoes, peppercorn mines, drumsticks drifting like shattered masts, or like oil slick seals blink in the sun. Idlis, plump and spongy lenses magnify our app, bring the stars within our reach. That ability to move from idlis to the stars and to pull it off, that's poetic slate, magic. And I'd like to conclude with really, at least this part of the presentation, by just saying that the other aspect, the final thing that I'd like to talk about is the tone in Kolatkar's poems, which is always deadpan, ironic, offhand, deceptively casual. And it's that, I think, that is able to bring together effortlessly stone and God in the Kala Ghoda poems. It's able to bring together this very specific gazelle with a twisted ankle and ancient myth in Sarpasatra. It's able to bring together idlis and stars in Kala Ghoda, and in his translations of the Bhakti poets, it's able to bring together the body and the beyond. And there's really several poems there that I'd like to mention, but the one I'd like to read is one by Janabai, the Varkari mystic poet, the woman mystic, who herself was a domestic servant in the home of Namdev. And what I love that poem and his translation of it is just the way it moves with absolute impunity from the physical to the sacred, without seeing any divide between the two. I eat God, I drink God, I sleep on God, I buy God, I count God, I deal with God. God is here, God is there, void is not devoid of God. God is within, God is without, and moreover, there's God to spare. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Arundhati, I'm sorry, I just have one request of you. While you were reading the idlis bit, your voice broke a little. Would you mind reading it?
The idlis? Okay.
Thank
okay.
you.
Back to idlis, with pleasure. Islands of idlis float belly up or splash about in seas of sambar, red cheese, submerged tomatoes, peppercorn mines, drumsticks drifting like shattered masts, or like oil slick seals blink in the sun. Idlis, plump and spongy lenses magnify our appetites, and through the telescope of shared hope, bring the stars within our reach.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And for all the audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them out in the chat box and we'll come to questions from the audience later. Thank you so much, Arundhati, for these splendid readings and talking about how you read Kolatkar and the image that stands out for you. Thank you so much. Laetitia, I'll hand it over to you now. If you could speak a little bit about your entry point to Arun Kolatkar.
Thank you, Saranya, and thank you, Arundhati. It's indeed a great pleasure to be in conversation with both of you. And I told Arundhati that how much I admire her work as well, so it's even more a pleasure to be in conversation with her. And I think what I'm going to say about my own entry point to Kolatkar connects to a lot of things that you've already said. So there's already a dialogue happening. So I'll also start, I think, by a very short poem by Kolatkar, since a poem through which I discovered his poetry. And it was also in a library, leafing through anthologies of modern Indian poetry. And it's the poem A Butterfly. And I've often said that you can, you know, stumble upon a work of art or a literature like you fall in love. There's the same element of randomness, total randomness, and wonder or enchantment. And I think enchantment was very much there when I started reading a butterfly, along with the conviction, or the conviction that you know, suddenly a voice sounded right, and that it was speaking to me. And I think the poetry, the best poetry is addressed, I mean, or you feel, the reader feels that it's addressed to him or to her. And it's also the conviction of having stumbled upon a kind of treasure of sorts that kind of drove me to try and translate him. So I'll just start by a butterfly. Um, the butterfly. There is no story behind it. It is split like a second. It hinges around itself. It has no future. It is pinned down to no past. It's a pun on the present. It's a little yellow butterfly. It has taken these wretched hills under its wings. Just a pinch of yellow. It opens before it closes, and closes before it. Oh, where is it? So what drew me, what appeals to, I mean, what drew me to this poem, and what continues to draw me to so many of Kolatkar's poems, is at the same time the extraordinary tenderness of his voice, the extraordinary humor, and his extraordinary faculty of vision. I think you also said, Arundhati, you also talked about his capacity to a kind of amorous radiographic attention to what is considered insignificant, unworthy, or what goes unnoticed. And I think Kolatkar teaches us to see, or perhaps teaching might not be a very good word, because he often said that he was totally anti-education, but at least he invites us to look again, yes, to look longer, to look from different sides, to watch out. And in this poem, in The Butterfly, there is it's everything but a metaphysical poetry. There is a concreteness, a thisness about his poems, and which is never transcended. And when I think, Arundhati, you also spoke about Kalagoda poems, and everything about Kalagoda poems is about you know, the ground, is about stone, is about food, is about sex as well, is about touch, is about the body and its various hungers. And I'll talk, if we have time, I'll talk about the irreverence of Kolatkar's voice. But I think in many of his poems, there's this double movement of irreverence and, yes, like Arundhati said, absolute reverence. And though it's everything but a metaphysical poetry, it's at the same time a poetry of celebration, of exaltation, and praise that rejoices in the everyday, just like it rejoices in a butterfly, which is an epiphany of sort, an ordinary epiphany of sort that you pin down. And there's this very, very famous quotation by Kolatkar in an interview given by Eunice de Souza, I think, where he says, and I'll just read it, "The miracle of life itself becomes a divine thing. The tumbled bricks and broken slabs are not what makes the spot holy, but wherever a bitch gives birth is probably a holy space, a holy place, sorry. And certainly, yes, in Jejuri, there's this displacement of the sacred, not in the gold gods in tidy rows. I think that's from the poem, The Cupboard, but elsewhere, not in its appropriate, proper context. In a stone, for example. And remember the Chaitanya, one of the Chaitanya poems where Chaitanya pops a stone in his mouth and spits out gods. And you also have in Kalagoda poems, yes, this, I think almost all of this, that the poems have this double movement of reverence and irreverence, this displacement of the sacred. And Kolatkar challenges all the, moral, religious, even literary proprieties to conflate, for example, queens and tarts, prostitutes and pilgrims, idlis and sacraments, and to show that, yes, tarts are queens, prostitutes are pilgrims. And he also talks about, there's also the poem called The Shit Sermon. But I'm sure we'll go back to that later on in the conversation. And I think what strikes me also in the butterfly poem, which is common in so many of Kolatkar's other poems, is the lightness of touch. Kolatkar never imposes his voice on what he sees. He lets what he sees surface. He gives it time. I think that's one of the most beautiful things that he does in his poetry is give time. So he gives it time to surface from the unknown, from the unexpected, without labeling it, without naming it. And for example, if you think of a poem like A Butterfly, but in so many other poems, think of Man of the Year, he first says it, and then just halfway through the poem, we discover it's a butterfly. That's, I think, recurrent in so many of his poems. So he doesn't circumscribe what he sees. And I think this lightness of touch is also, yes, related to the voice that he uses, the anti-colloquial simplicity, anti-discursive also. Remember the first line of A Butterfly, there is no story behind it. These are essentially spoken poems. That's why I think you said yesterday when we just had this, Saranya, we just tried the Zoom, and you said that, some of his poems cannot be read, or perhaps Kolatkar's poems cannot, do not lend themselves to oral, to reading out loud. And I think that's not true. I think they do lead themselves to reading them out loud. Arvind Krishna Mehrotra, who is here, in his introduction to the Vinod Kumar Shukla translation that he did with Sararai, talks about, quotes a few lines actually from another butterfly poem, from a Shukla poem, which is about a little yellow butterfly flying above the ground. And he makes this distinction, between the ground hugging writer and the earth leaving writer. And I think Kolatkar is very much a ground hugging writer. And if you think about the pie dog, who opens Kalagoda poems, that's exactly his position. He's hugging the ground, jaw at rest on crossed forepaws, on his paws, and registering everything that comes into his vision. So every single crack, every stone, again, what is considered unworthy or unspectacular. So I don't know if I have a little time to talk a little bit more about Kalagoda poems. But I think a few things, perhaps. What strikes me about so many of Kolatkar's poems is that they can be read at so many different levels. And for example, if you think about To a Crow or about Mira, they're at the same time very realistic poems, street poems about, one is about a crawl in Kalagoda. The other one is about a rag picker in Kalagoda. So street poems. They are also poems about the making of poetry. They're poems about poetry, you know, from ordinary things and twigs, ordinary words and sounds. And they're also, at least that's my reading, I think they're also political poems, or they can lend themselves to a political reading, even though Kolatkar, everybody knows that, was you know, cultivated a non-committal attitude and did not want to take any political public stance, or any, you know, public stance whatsoever. So you have Mira, and if we have time, perhaps I'll read a few lines from Mira, you know, who's a road sweeper and a rag picker of the Bombay streets. And I think she's also an alter ego of the poet, who collects what is used or useless, abandoned on the wayside, and transforms it into art. And remember that Kolatkar actually wrote in a wonderful meditation, a wonderful unpublished text until Arvind published it, Making Love to a Poem. He wrote that his poems were stolen, salvaged, plundered from rubbish heap, junkyard, graveyard. And he was talking about his own poems, the, you know, earlier versions of Marathi poems, of English poems that he was scavenging and, you know, reusing, recycling, transfiguring, and about poems of others. And we know that he scavenged Tukaram and other Bhakti poets. Yeah, I think all this rubbish, as I said before, so Mira collects rubbish. All this rubbish is given time and space, and kind of poetry, and the metaphor of shipwrecked refugees marooned on a deserted island runs through the collection. And I think he also gives us, and I'll end on that, another representation of the city, another representation of Bombay, but also of poetry and of India, that hasn't been cleansed of its rubbish, of its refuse, which I think also stands for, you know, the poor, the migrants, the Dalits, all, you know, refugees of sorts. And I think, you know, the title of the talk today was Reading Kolatkar Under Lockdown. And so I think it's, you know, yeah, rubbish also stands for all those lives who are often considered expendable or disposable, but which are given center stage in this poetry. And in the long central poem Breakfast Time at Kalagoda, there are a few lines which I'll quote, and I'll just end it by that and perhaps read just a few lines from Mira. Boy, am I glad they've left at least this one tiny traffic island alone, haven't landscaped it to death, put a fence around it and slapped logos all over it. And I think landscape to death must also be read literally. So I'll just perhaps read, do I have time to read a few lines from Mira? Yeah, okay, great. I was also, another favorite of mine, but I told you that it was so difficult to choose one, is The Ogress, but I'll read a few lines from Mira. Since it's so long, I'll just start by the third movement. When most art critics are still in bed, sleeping off the effects of last night's free drinks, with a cache of cashew nuts they squirreled away still in their pockets, a fresh new series of installations goes on display in front of the Jehangir Art Gallery, still sleeping, with its mouth open as usual, with no fanfare and unseen by any, save a few discerning crows and a kitten, in the form of modest piles of rubbish all along the curb, at regular intervals of about 15 paces perhaps, and consisting of dry leaves, scraps of paper, prawn shells, onion skins, potato peels, cast-off condoms, dead flowers, mostly gulmohur and coppercod. The installations might as well have been titled homage to Bombay 1, homage to Bombay 2, and so on, since a good bit of the city stands on sweepings such as these, all of Colaba, for example, or Ketwadi. The exhibition is open for no more than about half an hour every morning, but by the time the last pile of rubbish has been lovingly put together, the first one is ready for the trolley, which is the whole point, really, to celebrate the essential impermanence of all art. I'll just skip one movement and go to the last two. When it is full, nearly to the brim, she climbs to the top and begins to dance within the narrow compass of the wicker bin, like a Mira before her lord, a Mira with a broomstick for a lute. Shifting her weight from one foot to the other, she turns around herself by slow degrees, giving her toes enough time to genuflect and offer obeisance to all the cardinal points, to each of the 32 compass points in turn. Her free arm, raised in the air, is a flamingo in flight. Bearing down on the load of rubbish, treading it down to compact it and make room for more, with skilled feet, she tramples it like a vineyard wench in a tub of grapes. As they sink deeper into themselves, eggshells and dead flowers, dry leaves and melon rinds, breadcrumbs and condoms, chicken bones and potato peels start giving off their essence, exude the wine of worthlessness, express an attar of thankfulness that floods the cracks on her heels, licks the soles and arches of her feet, anoints caloses, and rises between her toes.
Thank you. That was lovely. Thank you so much. Um, I will speak a little bit now on my entry point to Arun Kolatkar, which is very much in tandem with what Arundhathi and Laetitia have also spoken, which is how I learned from Kolatkar how to read poetry, how to write, and how to notice the image. And essentially, on a very personal level, I read Arun Kolatkar to read Bombay. I'm not sure if that's the right way to read a poet, or if there is a right way to read a poet. But the first time really I came across Kolatkar was when I was 16 or 17, and I read The Turnaround. And as someone who has lived in Bombay all her life, I felt like for the first time I was taken on a journey from Bombay, and I was brought back to Bombay. And at the end of the poem, when he says, "It was time for me to turn around," I turned back to the beginning of the poem, and I found myself reading it all over again. So that really got me interested in him. And the more I read, the more I started asking the questions that I think students of literature do ask, which is, what is a poem essentially? What makes a poem? Who is the poet? And I just want to read out one poem that I can't forget, because it is the first poem that made me ask these questions, which is, "My name is Arun Kolatkar. My name is Arun Kolatkar. I had a little matchbox. I lost it, then I found it. I kept it in my right hand pocket. It is still there." I remember when I read this, by then I had read quite a bit about Arun Kolatkar, that other writers had written about him, other critics had written about him. But I found this so funny, and I found it absolutely fascinating, because how could someone be so tongue-in-cheek in a poem? And that's something that really drew me to his style of writing as well. I think my interest in Arun Kolatkar really peaked when I wasn't in Bombay, when I was at university, which was in Haryana. And every time I felt super nostalgic for home. And if anyone asked me what I miss the most about home, I would say I just miss my lane, the streets of Bombay. And I felt like nostalgia led to a kind of veneration or glorification of the city. That really, I was shocked back into reality every summer when I went back home. And I was just angry and irritated at the noise and the pollution and all these movies that I'd watch about, Bombay, and the books I'd read about, the Bombay books and the Bombay songs and the Bombay movies, they didn't feel very honest. They felt like a very superficial perspective on the city. And Laetitia and Arundhati, you both have spoken about how Kolatkar kind of notices the ordinariness of the everyday, the very ordinary, general aspects that we often miss out on, that he notices, just as the crow does in his poem, Who Has the Poetic Lens, and really zooms in on things that we pass by every day but don't really take note of. And yet, while reading the Kala Ghoda poems, I, I I found them so funny. I found them not taking themselves too seriously, yet at the same time exposing these very subtle truths about Bombay, about, like you said, Laetitia, the cleanup drives that try to happen with the change of politics in the city, the people who were left literally marooned on the island, the the way that the narrative is trying to be changed to pin Bombay down as Mumbai, to pin it down as a city with a singular identity, with a singular history, with a singular language. And the more I read Kolatkar's poems, the more I found that that really isn't the case. Um, I learned the history of Bombay through the Pi dog who acknowledges that on his father's side, he comes from the dog who helped Yudhishthir reach the heavens, but he chooses his ancestry from his mother's side, the bitch who was brought from England by Sir Bartle Frere. And the way the Pi dog kind of asserts his identity and his history and his own narrative, he has agency over himself. And I learned Bombay's history through the little charas pill, the ball of hashish that travels from Afghanistan through the Hindu Kush mountains down to Bombay, which really kind of speaks about the geographical history, the shared history of the subcontinent. I learn about how yesterday's commodities become today's rubbish. You'll find the scraps of junk that Kolatkar describes in detail and in very beautiful musical ways. You'll find them to be commodities. The man of the year has a hat from Chor Bazaar. You'll find red combs, just scraps of metal, a little pinwheel, things that are used but then are forgotten. The people almost seem like spillovers of this developed city, of this city that's full of high rises, yet they occupy spaces that cannot be pinpointed upon. When I was walking around Bombay, I was trying to find the banyan tree under which two people were playing a game of checkers. I was trying to find these locations. I was trying to find the Wayside Inn, which unfortunately isn't there anymore. The Samovar Cafe is not there anymore. So there are these parts of history of Bombay that you don't find, yet these characters assert the land, they claim their land. You have Parmeshwari, who's the pipe smoking mama, the lavatory attendant, who has a kachi, leathery face, and the way she's described almost makes it seem like she's guarding the Jahangir Art Gallery, which is an iconic building of art in Bombay. And you have the barefoot queen of Crossroads, who is a queen in her own right. She asserts her place on the ground, and the wall of the Wayside Inn Cafe rises behind her like a throne. So the way that Kolatkar wrote these characters is like they are subverting the identity of Bombay as being connected to the buildings, the high rises, the colonial structures. And he makes it about the very mobile people whose history cannot be tied down. And I found this irreverence that both Arundhati and Laetitia have spoken about in the Shit Sermon. And I'll just read a little bit from the Shit Sermon, which is my favorite poem as well. Shit City, he thunders. The Lion of Bombay thunders. Shit City. I shit on you. You were a group of 7 shitty islands given in dowry to the shit king of ink to shit on. And now it's all one big high-rise shit, waiting for God to pull the flush. And it won't be long, for God is great. The words rise like a flock of shadow ravens from his mouth, circle in the sky above, over the stock exchange, the high court, and the mantralaya, before settling down on the rooftops all around. a pie dog sneaks up on him from behind and bites him on the ass. Once again, there's this. He creates such fantastic images. He creates this drunk who's yelling curses at the city, rises above all these tall, the three buildings that are imperative to the systems of economy, politics, and the judicial system of Bombay. Yet his curses of Bombay rise above them and settle like a flock of shadow ravens. And once again, just when you think Kolatkar is taking it seriously, a pie dog comes from behind and bites the man on his ass. So it ends on such a funny note, but there's so much said in a few lines. Um, and I recognize now every time now that Bombay has changed so much and it's a constantly changing city, I find it hard to recognize the place that I grew up in. But I always turn back to Arun Kolatkar. It's sort of my own turnaround where I turn around and I go back to his poems and just walking around the city and following his poems to walk around the way that he makes me go zigzag back and forth. The same poem will go from Mahim to Baikala, back to Kalagoda, Kolaba. It just teaches me how Bombay, how he fractures the city, makes it almost a disjointed place that cannot be held together by a single language or an identity or a singular history, because you still have the spectral presence of David Sassoon looming around, disappointed at the way his city is turned out. So just to conclude, right now is where Bombay has changed under lockdown, and it's a little hard to recognize a city this quiet where the occasional car whizzes by. So I just it feels like Kolatkar kind of captured that as well. And I just want to read one last poem, Traffic Lights. 50 phantom motorcyclists, all in black, crash helmeted outriders, faceless behind tinted visors, come thundering from one end of the road and go roaring down the other, shattering the petrified silence of the night like a delirium of rock drills, preceded by a wailing cherry top, and followed by a faceless president in a deathly white Mercedes, coming from the airport and going downtown, raising a storm of protest in its wake, from angry scraps of paper and dry leaves, but unobserved by traffic lights that seem to have eyes only for each other, and who, like ill-starred lovers, fated never to meet, but condemned to live forever and ever in each other's sight, continue to send signals to each other throughout the night, and burn with the cold passion of rubies separated by an empty street. So thank you. That's also the last poem till Kala Ghoda poems.
Well, I've never met Arun. I don't think I would be the best person to answer that question. Yes, he was an elusive character. I mean, he was a missing person of sorts. Um, Going back to Adil's collection. And he indeed, I think, you know, he didn't take part in any conferences and on any public readings. And so, yeah, in a sense, he did want to stay invisible. But he did have you know, a gang of friends, and he straddled different worlds. I mean, a gang of friends, you know, poets writing in English, but also Marathi friends, and he would often read his poems out loud to them. So yes, he was an invisible or a missing person in a sense. At the same time, if you wanted to find him, you knew where he was, right? I mean, he was always at the same places, and I guess if you would, you know, go to the Wayside Inn and wanted to talk to him, I imagine that he wouldn't, you know, that he would welcome you to his table. Um, but yeah, you know, I think his main focus was writing and rewriting his poetry, and not necessarily getting involved in, you know, the poetry readings and the poetry scene. Definitely. Yeah. So let me go back to Heart of Runes, but I think, yes, Kolatkar would definitely connect his poems to each other. And I mean, for example, a collection like Kalagoda poems is full of echoes from one poem to the other. And you can actually, I mean, you can read all these poems, Kalagoda poems, like a book, you know, which opens at daybreak, closes at sunset, and you have all these characters converging on that stage of the traffic island, and the characters, you know, come back. So definitely, yeah, I think his poems do echo each other, and his collections often, whether they were written in Marathi or in English, also I think do echo each other. So certainly, but I don't really. Let me go back to A Heart of Rune. Perhaps we could read it, Saranya. Let me just go back to it. I don't have the table of contents just now. If you have it in front of you.
I have it, yes.
So A Heart of Rune. Do you want to read it, Saranya, or?
Sure. Shall I?
Sure.
Good. The roof comes down on Maruti's head. Nobody seems to mind. Least of all Maruti himself. Maybe he likes the temple better this way. A mongrel bitch has found a place for herself and her puppies in the heart of the ruin. Maybe she likes the temple better this way. The bitch looks at you guardedly, past a doorway cluttered with broken tiles. The pariah puppies stumble over her. Maybe they like the temple better this way. The black-eared puppy has gone a little too far. A tile clicks under its foot. It's enough to strike terror in the heart of a dung beetle and send him running over to the safety of the broken collection box that never did get a chance to get out from under the crushing weight of the roof beam. No more a place of worship, this place is nothing less than the house of God.
Yeah, I think the last two lines say it all, right? Um, I quoted just a few minutes ago, you know, this excerpt from Kolatkar interview where he says, I'll quote them again: "The miracle of life itself becomes a divine thing. The tumbled bricks and broken slabs are not what makes the spot holy, but wherever a bitch gives birth is probably a holy place." And I think so. Kolatkar never commented his poems. He disliked talking about poetry. What he liked was reading poems and writing them. But I think that's the best. If you want to make a comment on this poem or explain this poem, I think that's the best comment or explanation you can get. You know, the miracle of life itself becomes a divine thing.
I just have one question, which is what we were talking about earlier. The title of the Bombay Poet. I myself, I do consider Arun Kolatkar almost an extension of Bombay. I don't know if that's right or wrong, and I choose to read Bombay through his writing. So I was just curious: is the title of a Bombay poet of sorts? Do you think that's a fair one, and do you think it is fair to consider Arun Kolatkar as a Bombay poet?
Oh, I think it's totally fair. Yeah, of course. I don't remember exactly his exact words, but I think also in the Eunice de Souza interview, and really if you want to know a little bit more about Kolatkar, this interview, he gave very seldom interviews, and this interview is just absolutely brilliant. And I think he says at one point, you can call me a Hindu poet, you can call me a Marathi poet, you can call me a Brahmin poet, you can call me so many different things. Once again, there's so many etiquettes possible. And they're all as good as each. I mean, they're all fine. They're all relevant. So yes, Bombay Poet, definitely. I think Bombay Poet, yeah, of course. And I think you know, like other writers of the time, for example, Nissim Ezekiel. I think he is absolutely, yes, indistinguishable from Bombay, and he never wanted to leave Bombay. And there's the whole mythology of Kolatkar, you know, who lived in a one-bedroom flat for most of his life, without telephone, without television, but going back to Kalagoda and you know, walking the same streets. So yeah, he was absolutely, and he didn't want to leave Bombay. So he is indistinguishable from his city. And I think that the category of, you know, Bombay poets, I think it's something that a lot of poets of the time, and even poets who haven't lived all their life in Bombay, or only lived for a couple of years, for example, Arvind Krishna Mehrotra. And I think, yeah, it's an identity that they would claim, because I think Anjum Hassan says in one of her articles that Bombay was also the place where poetry was made possible because of, I mean, we could talk about Bombay in the 50s and 60s, 40s, 50s and 60s for a very long time, but there was an incredible energy, definitely, about Bombay at the time, and a creative energy, yeah.
Firstly, I just want to know, has Arvind spoken? Because it was wonderful to see that Arvind was actually online as well. Has he had a chance to say something? It would be good to hear from him.
It would be great, but I think he's disappeared.
Oh, he's disappeared.
I mean, he's still,
okay.
we still have his image, but we don't have, I mean, he's not here.
Okay.
He's
okay.
out of the frame.
All right. So as far as the Bombay poet thing goes, the descriptor goes, Saranya, I'd say that, I mean, certainly for me, an early image is one of Kolatkar hunched over his table at the Wayside Inn. You know, I remember those very sharp, observant eyes under shaggy eyebrows. You know, that's something I remember quite. He was very much part of my landscape growing up. And at the same time, I must say that I have mixed feelings about this category of Bombay poet. It all depends on how it's used. Yeah. So I've known those who've used it in particularly ungenerous ways. So I've known those who've talked about Bombay poets as some kind of cozy cartel of passionless, craft-conscious versifiers. That is all craft and not enough creativity. I've heard of those who've used the notion of Bombay poet to mean just a bunch of very rootless, anchorless, alienated vagabonds, sort of flâneurs walking the streets and looking for meaning. You know, so there are many ways in which the term is used. For me, Bombay is the city I was born into. It was a city in which I searched for some sense of cultural belonging as well. And yes, the poetry circle happened, and there were mentor figures who happened later. You know, Eunice was a teacher, but I'd say as a mentor, there was Nissim Ezekiel, later the, you know, other poets whom one got to know and whose work one admired, whether it was Adil Jasawala or Geet Patel or Imtiaz Dharkar and so on. But I found that my understanding of what it meant to be a Bombay poet actually deepened the further I went from Bombay. So when I actually left Bombay for spells of time, I found myself wanting to return. And I began to ask myself why. And I think that's when I realized that Bombay is the kind of city, and there are a few cities that have this quality, where the more you unbelong, you do in fact belong. And I began to realize that in many ways, much as I had railed against aspects of my upbringing, and as many of us do, railed against it, I also found ways to reclaim it. And I think that's when I found that I am a Bombay poet, because it's offered me a particular ecosystem that's been nourishing in ways that I didn't even imagine, you know. And I think that's the quality in Kolatkar's work that draws me, that sense of being on the margin and belonging for that very reason. Being a Bombayite for that very reason. Being on the margin, but being able to see margin as vantage point, as a place from which you can access whole canyons of cultural memory, on both sides. You can be a dual citizen. You can be a person capable of multiple citizenship if you want. And I think this is something that Kolatkar's poetry demonstrates time and again. He stands between two languages. He's between the local and the cosmopolitan. He's between poet and translator. He's between image and word. There are so many ways in which he, I think, demonstrates that periphery can be possibility. And I think that for me is what Bombay means. If I were to consider myself to be a Bombay poet, that's what it means.
Thank you. Thank you for that. All right, I think that's it. Thank you so much, Arundhathi. Laetitia, do you have any parting words?
Laetitia, how about you?
No, not really. Thank you. And I just hope that we'll soon be able to have all these conversations live and not virtually, because the virtual dimension is I mean, it's helpful, but we need to see each other.
Desperately. So
yeah.
Absolutely here. And Saranya, thank you for making it happen. And I hope it'll be the start of many more conversations. Yeah,
I do hope
many more. I think there are many others with whom these conversations should happen, really, around Kolatkar, since that is a passion of yours.
I hope so. Yes.
Thank you, Saranya. Thank you, Laetitia. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Arundhathi.
Thank you.
See you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.